Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones about ways to handle rejection in a professional manner. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Allison Monahan, and typically I'm here with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're thrilled to have ex-recruiter Sadie Jones with us to talk about how to handle rejection professionally. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. Well, let's start by talking about why this topic even matters, because, I'm sure none of our listeners are ever going to experience any type of professional rejection. Will they?
No, of course not. I'm sure they will ace everything they ever do. I think we're talking about it because a lot of our listeners are people who have done really well, probably up to this point, and so they may not have experienced this before. And it's a good thing to think about because you want to react correctly.
Right. Let's be honest. This is something that eventually happens to everyone. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how smart you are, how hard you work, how perfect you try to be. There's going to come a time where you're not going to have something that you want. And it's important to really consider and even possibly practice like what your response is going to be, because I think this has a real possibility to kind of sink people, because this is the sort of thing people remember.
Absolutely. And I think that from the side of the student, you have to remember that there are things that are out of your control. So you don't really need to necessarily take it personally. And I think that's kind of where people go wrong.
Yeah, we'll talk about that for sure later. Because I do think, of course, there's a tendency if someone rejects you to say like, oh, this is so personal, I'm a terrible person, they hate me. And that may just not be the case. So yeah, let's kind of run through some examples just to kind of give an idea of what we're talking about. And also, so people can think about ways this might come up. For example, an obvious one, maybe you don't get a job, right?
Absolutely. So it could be, that you don't get the summer job that you've been interviewing for. It could be that you get the summer job, but you don't get the full-time offer. It could be later down the line with a job, an internship. Maybe you're applying for a clerkship. Those are some more on the job front side.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe, your professor doesn't pick you to be a TA or pick you to be a research assistant. You're applying to a clinic and you don't get the clinic that you want. Even things like promotions at work or certain work assignments that you're interested in doing.
Maybe you don't get the practice group that you wanted.
Exactly. Law review. That's another fun one. Either you don't get onto the law review, or maybe you want to be on the board and you're not picked to be on the board, or you're not picked to be the position that you want to be. Or even clubs, there can be some crazy stuff that goes on. Obviously you can probably join whatever club you want typically, but they might not make you an officer. People can find all kinds of things to get upset with. Another one, like even a senior lawyer that you'd like to work with at your job and you're not getting those type of assignments. Or I've even seen some really funny / terrible reactions in law firm life where people got bad decisions from a judge and just kind of lost it.
That seems like something you should definitely not take personally.
Oh, yeah.
And I imagine that's going to happen a lot in your career.
Yeah, that's if you're a litigator, the reality is you're not going to win every case. You're not going to win every motion. I
don't even know if this is a rejection, but I've seen people not get the office that they want or the secretary they want and get very upset about it.
Oh, yeah. Any firm I've worked at, there's been this incredibly elaborate process for trying to get people into offices. And there are always hurt feelings.
Yeah.
No, once, in fact, a partner went crazy I don't think the judge even did anything particularly, like maybe made like a preliminary decision on something, and he went totally nuts in an email and accidentally copied her talking about what an idiot she was.
Oh my God.
Yeah, talk about what not to do.
Yeah, and I'm sure that everyone remembered that.
Oh,
and I bet that they wouldn't have remembered whatever the decision was.
I literally have absolutely no idea what this was even about, but I do definitely remember the aftermath where there's that moment where you get this reply all, and you're like, did that just go to the person I think it went to? And you're like, oh yeah, and then you're just waiting for the phone to ring to be like, oh my gosh. You know?
Well, and I think that's such a good example of how the initial situation that caused the rejection probably wasn't that big of a deal, and no one would have remembered it, and where your reaction is the thing that
became instantly legendary.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and also, certainly did the client no favors. Now the judge hates the partner on this case, and I mean, certainly is going to remember that. He had to grovel, chambers and apologize, and I mean, it became this pretty big deal.
That's just horrible and embarrassing.
Super embarrassing. I mean, to be honest, it was sort of funny watching it from the outside, but this is not what you want to do.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, I'm sure as a recruiter, you must have seen some pretty unprofessional reactions. What type of things do people do when they're rejected to make themselves look bad?
Well, I think that usually it would come down to someone being defensive. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where there was an issue. I have to say that it would come up more with, from the recruiter side, with someone getting an offer to come for the summer. Because usually if you're getting rejected and you've been there for the summer, like, people have more of an idea that it's going to happen. And so if you've just gone through an interview process and you feel like you did great and you don't really have any feedback on it, and then you find out that you didn't get the job, I think I saw some reactions where people kind of lashed out or talked about how great they were, or kind of bad-mouthed the firm. I didn't want to work there anyway. And generally this isn't common, but they're memorable, the times where I've seen that. So to me, it came from a place of defensiveness and not a place of really trying to understand, that it's probably not personal. And it probably, just came down to maybe somebody was a better fit, or, they didn't have the exact right qualifications we were looking for, or whatever it is. I think that's where the bad reaction came from.
Right. Well, can you talk a little bit more about this issue of is it or is it not personal? Because, I mean, it feels personal, right, if you're rejected. But what kind of things might be coming into play here?
For sure, it definitely feels personal, and I think anyone who's been rejected when applying for a job feels that way. But what I would say is you should remember that you don't know who the other people are who are applying. So there might be someone who really was a better fit, or for whatever reason, got chosen over you. And I know that is a hard thing to face, that they pick someone else instead of you. But I think there's just a lot of factors that you couldn't have taken into account. And, you don't know what their hiring needs are. Maybe as the process went on, they realized that they were more limited. Maybe more people accepted than they expected. Maybe you were the next person who was going to get an offer. And the other thing to keep in mind is you never know where it's going to come around again. So maybe you weren't the right fit right now. It doesn't mean you're never the right fit.
Right. I think that's true. I mean, I remember I was interviewing in San Francisco during my clerkship, and I found out, I think at the end of one of the interviews, one of the partners sort of said to me, like, I'm not even sure we're really hiring right now. I don't know why we're interviewing all these people. Yeah, and the other thing, I mean, I think you make a great point about a question of timing. Like, maybe you're not the right fit right now, but maybe you will be the right fit. And I think it's also important to keep in mind, just because someone's rejected you, that doesn't mean the relationship itself is necessarily over, does it?
No, definitely not. I mean, I think the relationship could be over if you handle it badly, say the wrong thing. I think you could end it.
Right. It doesn't have to be. But I think
that, yeah, absolutely not. And I think the legal world is small, and especially in certain markets, so where it will come back around again. So I don't think the relationship has to be over. And I think that if it's a place that you're really interested in, or people you're really interested in, that I don't think you should see it as a relationship was over. I think you should try to, keep up with people, and try not to make it personal. Because I think most of the time it really isn't. And most of the time, if you got that far, they thought you were qualified, and it probably came down to something small between you and somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes people, frankly, like regret the choice that they make to hire someone else. So maybe in a year or so, when you come back around and you apply again and you say, oh, I really enjoyed meeting everyone, and here's some things that I've done to make myself a more competitive candidate. I think, if they're now having buyer's remorse over that person that seemed so amazing, but maybe they weren't, like this would be a good chance for you to get back in the good graces. What general advice do you have about how people should handle these situations?
Well, one, I wouldn't do anything right away. So I would take a step back from it. So if you hear on the phone, I feel like whatever initial reaction I would make very simple and thanks for your time. I really appreciated getting to meet everybody or something like that. And then if you want to follow up later, I would think about it more. If it's an email, that gives you more time. But I would say don't have that emotional reaction right away. And that's where preparing yourself for either outcome is kind of a good idea, to maybe go through it. Like, what would I say if?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe don't even answer your telephone. If they leave a voice message, then you can call back and you can be kind of mentally prepared. Honestly, I feel like most people probably, I don't know, what do you think? Do you think people like to give bad news on the phone or rather in an email or letter or something like that?
I feel so mixed on this. I worked somewhere where it was like we had to do everything on the phone, that somebody had sort of made that a rule. So yes or no. And a lot of people said, people don't want rejection over the phone. But for whatever reason at this firm, I think everyone sort of knew. Because I think to some people, like getting the rejection over the phone is sort of like an assault. You're being hit with something that you weren't expecting.
I feel like if I got a call from a recruiter at a firm and they asked me to call them back, I would assume it was good news, but I guess we can't necessarily assume that.
Exactly. So I would say that most places, I think, do rejections by email or even old school snail mail occasionally. So I think that is usually how it's going to come. But I would say that there are people who prefer to do things over the phone and you don't know what the call is going to be. So I would be prepared either way and make sure you have sort of a professional reaction, and to try not to make this super personal and emotional. Like, you can do that later with your friends and family.
Right. I feel like being disappointed is normal, but you don't want to make the situation worse with like a really oversized reaction where you're angry at the person or yelling at them, arguing with them about the decision, that kind of thing. That just never really okay. It's not going to be helpful either, because bad mouthing them or other people, it's just going to really make you look petty.
Exactly.
I remember in law school when someone who was very, very disappointed that she did not make law review, which is honestly like a pretty objective process. Like, she didn't have the grades for it. But right after the results came out, I had already planned a party, and some of the people at this party were on the law review, and I literally ended up having to ask her to leave my house because she was like basically bad mouthing other people. Well, they didn't deserve it. They just got on because of this, like blah, blah, blah. And I literally went over to her and was like, if you can't stop this, like, this is rude. We all hear you. It's not accurate. And you need to go if you're not going to be able to control yourself. And I remember that a lot more than I remember whether she was on law review or not.
That's awful. And I think that brings up a good point, where you might be upset at the place that made the hiring decision, and you might also feel upset if you find out who got the job instead of you. I wouldn't go there. Like, I think you weren't in the interview, or you don't know that person's credentials exactly. And I would say, you know what, be the bigger person and just say, I don't know why they got it. They're deserving also.
Well, and in this case,
and be gracious.
The person that she was bad-mouthing ended up being like a very highly ranked member of the editorial board the next year because they were totally competent and completely deserving. It's just one of those things you're like, just don't do that. Like, you never know. You never know also when someone's going to be in a position to help you out. And if you've been witnessed doing something along these lines, like, of course, no one is going to go to bat for you.
Yeah, I think just always try to be mature in these situations. And like I said, you can later be upset with the people in your life, who are close to you. But I think like on the public front and like with people who, other people on law review or other people at law school who you're not close with or, whatnot, I think you should be professional and be gracious.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fantastic place to have a therapist, to have a life coach, to have like some sort of exercise practice where you go and hit things. Of course, people get upset. We all get upset. And it's really just a question of, are you going to take a step back, be the bigger person, and walk away from this, not making the situation worse?
Yeah, and I think there's different scenarios where you get rejected. And so there might be certain ones where, like, for example, you've spent the summer at a firm and then you get rejected in terms of not getting like the full-time offer. And like I said, I think most likely you've probably had feedback and it probably isn't a total shock. But I think that's an example where it's like a bigger relationship and it's probably more, to it than something where, you've met with a few people for 30-minute interviews or they've just kind of looked at your credentials, that kind of thing. So I think there's different scenarios and different sort of levels of a reaction too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I got a cold offer from one of the firms I summered at. And, in the moment, I just remember being like, this is totally fine. Like, you can just put me down as a no. The feeling was definitely mutual. And then years later, I wrote about it. So, you never know when you might be able to use this as fodder for something else in your life too. But obviously,
That's
I would not have.
Great attitude.
Well, I would not have written about it in the moment. It was years later when it didn't matter. Well, here's a question. So, if you're rejected from something, is it ever okay to ask why?
Rarely people do ask why, I find. And occasionally, I think you do. I think it depends why you're asking it and also what your relationship is with the person that you're asking. So I think sometimes people ask it, again, from a place of defensiveness, where they want the person to prove, what was wrong with me? Why did you reject me and pick somebody else? I think coming from that kind of place is never going to work. I think, for example, like we just said about somebody not getting the full-time offer, there's a time where I think it's okay to say what happened here. Because there was like a long period of time, you did work, that kind of thing. And then I think it makes sense. And most likely you're going to get that information. I do think occasionally maybe it was just, sort of more of an initial, like they didn't get the summer associate offer. I think you can ask why if you really want feedback. I think most likely you're not going to get it. Very few people are honest about, how someone interviewed. I think they're more honest about sort of your work. But if you really like sort of have a relationship with the person, maybe you've talked to them a lot and you feel like you really want feedback to help you, that maybe you can ask. You also have to be prepared for a rejection there where they tell you that you're not going to get the feedback.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of particularly lawyers are very conscious about like legal implications of telling you why they don't want to hire you. I mean, we've had people sometimes apply for things and they ask for feedback. And I mean, honestly, a lot of times there's just not that much to say, or I know that they're not going to really hear it anyway. So it just, I mean, from like the side of the person doing the rejecting, I guess it just sort of feels a little bit pointless a lot of the time. Like, well, I mean, I could tell you this, but the fact that you submitted these materials for this job suggests that you're not self-aware enough to know that they weren't the right materials anyway. So I'm not sure anything I tell you is really going to help.
Right.
Yeah, I think
there are times where I would give feedback, like I would tell someone that they have a typo on their resume,
right,
or things like that, where I think they really need to know. And some people react badly to that.
Right. Well, that's the other thing. You have to be ready to hear this feedback. You have to be graceful about it. So if you ask someone, do you have any feedback for how I could improve my application? And they say, well, actually, yes. I see that there are 3 typos on your resume, and you come back with, well, that shouldn't matter. It's like, okay, you're not making yourself look good here.
Or the other thing is, if you don't respond to that at all, I think that if you've asked someone for feedback and they've gone out of their way to give it to you and given you some honest feedback, say thank you. Like, this is an example where you should be gracious and say, I appreciate it, because most people aren't going to give that to you. So I think that's an example where you need to also exactly like handle it well.
Yeah, because then you can sort of set yourself up, pretty conceivably, this is a relationship like we talked about that you might be able to salvage, so you ask for something, somebody says, well, actually, it turns out that, we had somebody with more experience and they had taken a clinic in this area, and you can come back and say, oh, that's really useful information. Like, thank you. And then if you happen to apply again, you can say, oh, I took your advice. I took the same clinic or a similar clinic, and I also did this other pro bono project in the area. And, people are going to respect that you actually listened to them.
Absolutely. And I will say from the recruiting side, I really remember everybody's name. I don't know if everybody does, but I would see people a lot of times as a lateral after they have some experience, and I would remember them from when they had interviewed, and sometimes they rejected us and sometimes we rejected them. But just because they didn't get an offer, to come as a 2L doesn't mean that we're not interested in them after they have experience down the road. And like I said, I really do remember. So, you can go back and look, but I would say a lot of times it does come back around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the legal world is a very, very small world, and people remember, as with any people remember bad behavior. Stories get passed around. There are situations that people find themselves in where they're able to do something not very nice, maybe for somebody that did something terrible when you're in law school. That's just kind of what happens. So don't be that person.
Absolutely. And I think, like we were saying before about the asking why or the getting more feedback, again, I would say maybe you've built more of a relationship with somebody, whether it's, the hiring partner or someone you met on campus or the recruiter. So I would say kind of maybe trust your instincts a little bit about what your relationship is and whether you can ask them for more information.
And I think that's a good point. If it's something like you're applying for a clinic as a 2L and you're not selected for the clinic, I think there it's absolutely fair to go to the person who's doing the selecting and say, hey, I'm really interested in doing this next semester or next year. What can I do to position myself to be a stronger candidate? Because they probably will tell you. And then if you do it, your odds are going to be a lot better. But I think you have to look at the context. Yeah, if it's some hiring partner you've never met, they're probably not going to have a lot to tell you, really.
Yeah, and they might remember that it was sort of annoying that this person
exactly.
was bothering them, if anything.
Yeah, don't be annoying.
Yeah.
Well, what type of advice do you have for people on not reacting in the moment? Because, it's great for us to talk about this and say, oh, be mature, be prepared. But the reality is when you maybe get a call and you think it's going to be, oh, congratulations, we'd love to have you. And they actually say, you know what, we're not going to take you. That can be hard.
That can be hard. And I guess it's hard to know exactly how, you're going to react in the moment. But again, I would say I would practice it ahead of time, like literally say what you would say if they tell you that. I think that people get their hopes up a lot or just assume that things are going well. If anything, I would say kind of prepare for the worst so that there isn't like a huge moment of, I had no idea that was going to happen. But I would say that the other thing is kind of have a standard thing that you're going to say so that you can go back to that in your head. Even if you are really upset in the moment, it's like, oh no, this is what I said I was going to say, and have that really prepared. Sort of like if someone asks you, do you have any questions in an interview? And maybe you can't think of anything in the moment or specific. That's why I think you really should have like a few questions that you always have in the back of your head. So I would just say like, thank you so much for your time, or I appreciated the chance to meet everybody, or, I hope to, maybe have another opportunity in the future or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right and fantastic advice. Having some sort of standard go-to when you're shocked in the moment of, so you have something to say that can basically get you off the phone if it's a phone conversation, or out of the room if it's an in-person conversation. I think your advice earlier about not responding immediately is definitely on point if you have that opportunity. So, in an email, don't respond with your first like, oh my God, how could you do this to me? Like, let that sit for a few hours or a day before you send it. But even in a conversation, it's okay to say, look, I need to take a second or whatever. But I think in general, it's best just to really wrap up as quickly as possible and get out of the room or get off the phone. If there's anything you want to follow up with later, you can do that later.
And I think something you really don't want to do in that moment is like somehow try to sell yourself or change their mind. I find occasionally that people sort of do this.
That's never going to work.
That is never going to work. And for some reason, I think that some people, it's sort of their go-to. Like, no, you made a mistake. This is why. I'm great.
Yeah, and it's that sort of thing. Like, oh, I'm sure you're great, but we're still not hiring you. You know, like this decision has been made.
Awkward.
It makes it very awkward.
Exactly.
Well, what about people? Some people are just criers. What if people either start to cry or think they're going to cry? What can they do?
I think this is hard because some people are, and a lot of times, I think all the time it hits you when you don't expect it. So it's not like you were planning to cry. And again, I think this would happen more with a situation where you had more invested in it. I don't think most people are crying when it's sort of, a first interview or that kind of thing. I think when you feel like it's personal or you've spent the summer somewhere or, even what you're saying about law review, I imagine there's times where that's been your dream, whatever.
For whatever reason, yeah.
For whatever reason. So I think that it would probably be something where you were more invested in it. I would say I would try to keep it in check the best you can. And I think you can say, I'm sorry, I'm really upset. Could I just, could I have a minute or could we talk later? I think try to just what we said, wrap it up quickly. Because they're probably uncomfortable too. They don't want to keep you there or keep you on the phone, especially if they know you're really upset. And I do think most people, they know this happens sometimes. And so I don't necessarily think they're going to hold it against you if something like that happens. But I think don't take this moment to, indulge it and kind of get into it with them or make it worse than it is. I would say I would just try to get out of it as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, one good tip I learned someplace, if you think you're about to start crying really inappropriately, one thing you can actually do to switch your brain is start doing basic arithmetic in your head. And something about this apparently changes the way that your brain is working in that moment and can actually, not all the time, but oftentimes can kind of be enough to break that cycle and give you enough time to basically get out of the room before you totally lose it.
And I think that's great. I think if you could come up with anything that makes you stop crying, at least for that moment, I think that's fabulous. And maybe everyone has something they can think about or go to. But I understand that these things a lot of times are out of our control. And you're upset and they understand that. And what they've told you is bad news. And they know that.
Nobody thinks it's pleasant to get rejected. But again, also the person having to reject you is pretty uncomfortable usually as well. And they may be having some sort of reaction that you're feeding off of. Yeah, you just want to cut it short.
And I think a lot of times other people don't know how to react to somebody crying, and it's sort of I'm not really supposed to touch them or I'm not supposed to, they're not really sure to handle it. So I would say, try to just get out of the situation quickly.
Yeah, exactly. What about if somebody just totally loses it and then they need to later try to make amends?
So I think this is a situation where you have to understand you might be rejected again because they might not accept your amends. But I do think that you can do that. You can try. I think own whatever you did, own whatever it was that, was so bad that you needed to go back and, and apologize or try to fix it. But I would also say make the amends kind of short and to the point. So you're not dragging this out any longer than it has to be, and just make it clear that, you reacted in a way that you're embarrassed about or isn't typical of you, and you apologize.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you really lose it and start yelling at someone in their office or something because they've rejected you, I think a follow-up email saying, I'm really embarrassed by this behavior and I hope that you, accept my apology, my sincere condolences, for this terrible behavior. Goodbye. Because most people are going to get that and be like, okay, that's reasonable. I appreciate that. Beyond that, absolutely. I think you don't want to go there.
Yeah, I think, no matter how badly you act initially, try to leave whatever the situation is on the best note that you possibly can. So maybe, right, that is an email or an amends or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think, say, for example, you don't get an offer and you have another couple of days and you're expected to wrap up your work or something. I mean, that is not the time to go completely ballistic and refuse to wrap up your work. Again, like, you need to behave professionally and put on the best face possible and just kind of make, obviously it's not a great situation. Other people understand that, but they're still going to respect that you behaved like a grown-up, basically.
Absolutely. I think there is usually a time to make it better. Whatever it was. There's usually a time where you can make a decision to act in a better or worse way. And so I would say, even if you've made mistakes before, like you said, there's still time to fix it a little bit, and there's still time to act professional and at least have them remember that, they did leave it okay and they did take it okay or whatever it was.
Yeah, although unfortunately sometimes there's correspondence between people who might get rejected and their outsized reaction to that news. On that note, any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
I think it's really where we started, which is I think that most of the time these rejections are not personal. And they don't need to be taken personally. And I know that it really feels that way in the moment. But I would say that I think kind of keeping a perspective on it and keeping a perspective that you're not the only one in this process. And so, there's a whole team of people looking at hiring decisions or, all sorts of things that we've talked about. And there's other people involved. And so there's a lot of unknowns. And so I don't think you need to take it as you're never going to get a job or this, you're so terrible or they're so terrible or anything like that. I think most of the time it's just not the right time or not the right fit. And you can just leave that where it is. You're going to find something else.
Right. And I think that's the point I would take away too, is oftentimes you're going to eventually look back on whatever this rejection is. It seems so horrible in the moment and realize, this was actually not a great fit for me anyway, or this opened up other doors. Okay, I wasn't able to get onto the law review, but I joined another journal and I became, a member of the board, and that worked out fantastic. You can't think of one rejection as just being, the end of everything and your career is over and you're never going to get the trajectory that you want. It's just not that way. It's opening up some other door that you can now step through that hopefully would be even a better fit than this supposed, dream opportunity that you've just been not gotten.
Absolutely. And I think the only reason it would be that way is if that's the attitude you have about it.
Oh, exactly.
So I think so much of it is mindset.
Agreed. Go back and check out our Mindset podcast. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you, Sadie, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Our pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, perhaps to work on your professional demeanor, check out careerdicted.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app because we would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.